It began with a sight that soldiers on the ground would never forget. A bomber, torn open by flak, smoke trailing from two engines, its aluminum skin shredded like paper, yet still refusing to fall. That image, witnessed countless times over Europe, became the signature of one of the most resilient aircraft ever built, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. And long before it earned its place in history, the B-17F was engineered piece by piece to answer a simple, brutal question of war. How much damage can a machine endure and still bring its crew home? The B-17F did not emerge from a single idea or innovation. It was the culmination of rapid experimentation in the 1930s, when military aviation was still young and far from the advanced science it is today. Designers were working with slide rules, draftsman's pencils, and wind tunnels barely 10 feet wide. But despite those limitations, Boeing's engineers created an aircraft whose structure combined elegance with remarkable durability. At 74 feet 9 inches long, with a wingspan just over 103 feet, the B-17F was close in size to a modern passenger jet. Yet what made it unique was what lay beneath the surface. Its skin was not thick armor, but stressed duralumin, a lightweight aluminum alloy, no thicker than a few credit cards placed together. It sounds impossible, but that thin metal was key to the plane's survival. Flexible enough to deform under fire, yet strong enough to keep the aircraft intact. Inside that delicate skin was a rigid skeleton. The fuselage was built around an arrangement of longerons and formers that distributed stress across the entire body of the aircraft. Each section of the fuselage had its own structural identity. Section 41 formed the nose, an unmistakable glass blister housing the bombardier and navigator. Section 42 held the pilots and the dorsal turret, an engineering marvel that allowed a single man to rotate two .50 caliber guns with remarkable speed. Section 43 was the heart of the aircraft, the bomb bay, flanked by narrow catwalks just wide enough for a man to pass. Section 44 contained the radio operator and the ball turret, a cramped steel sphere that demanded both courage and agility from the man inside. The remaining sections, 46, 47, 48, and 49, stretched rearward toward the tail, where the stabilizer rose like a flag planted in the sky. The wing design was equally sophisticated. A twin longeron framework, cross-braced with multiple trusses, carried the weight of 4 Wright Cyclone engines and massive fuel tanks hidden within the wing interior. Boeing engineers reinforced the wings with corrugated aluminum sheeting before applying the outer skin. It was a structure meant not only to lift the aircraft, but also to survive the heavy vibrations of .50 caliber gunfire, flak bursts, and emergency landings on damaged runways. Yet for all its strength, the B-17F was not a heavily armored aircraft. Its protection relied on carefully placed manganese steel plates mounted on rubber padding. These thin armor plates offered valuable defense against shrapnel and smaller rounds, but pilots understood their limits. Against a direct hit from a high-caliber cannon, no armor on the bomber could guarantee survival. The real shield was the aircraft's redundancy. Multiple control cables, backup electrical systems, and a structure that could absorb incredible punishment. Crews often returned with holes the size of door frames in their wings and still landed safely. Every choice Boeing made reflected the philosophy of the era. Aviation in the 1930s favored ruggedness. There were no computer simulations, no composite materials, no digital sensors. What engineers relied on was thick intuition and relentless testing. Over time, they learned that a bomber needed not only to fly far and carry heavy loads, it needed to stay controllable even after losing large portions of its structure. The B-17F embodied that lesson better than any aircraft of its generation. Even its fuel system hinted at the duality of strength and vulnerability. The standard wing tanks were enclosed in self-sealing rubber layers that swelled shut when punctured. But the additional Tokyo tanks designed to extend range, lacked metal housings and relied on gravity to feed the main system. These flexible tanks were efficient but dangerous. Under extreme heat, they could collect flammable vapors. Pilots knew that a single incendiary tracer could turn a wing into a fireball. And yet, mission after mission, the B-17F proved that it could endure. Stories circulated of bombers flying home with enormous sections of their tail missing, or returning on two or even one functioning engine. The airplane's survival record was not luck. It was the result of deliberate engineering, redundant fuel lines, duplicated electrical pathways, and a frame that could bend without collapsing. This combination of fragility and strength gave the B-17F its character. Its skin was thin, its armor modest, but its structure was remarkably forgiving. And for the men who trusted their lives to it, that mattered far more than the numbers written in any technical manual. When a B-17F rolled down the runway, fully loaded with bombs and fuel, it carried not only weapons and machinery, it carried the hopes of every crewman that whatever happened in the cold skies over Europe, this aircraft would bring them home again. The men who stepped inside a B-17F each brought a different skill, a different temperament, and a different burden. Yet once the wheels left the runway, their individual roles fused into a single living organism. A flying fortress was not merely a machine. It was a 10-man ecosystem where every action, voice, and heartbeat could decide life or death. And inside this cramped, unheated, vibrating steel shell, these men built a working rhythm that modern crews, flying in temperature-controlled glass cockpits, can scarcely imagine. The commander sat in the left seat, though his authority extended far beyond the cockpit. A good pilot was expected not only to control the aircraft, but also to manage the morale and coordination of everyone aboard. He was the calm center when German fighters made their runs, when flak burst against the windows, and when shrapnel tore through wiring that kept the fortress in the sky. His co-pilot sat to the right, his equal in skill, but subordinate in command. If the pilot was the heart, the co-pilot was the second heartbeat, ready at any moment to take over should the first falter. Many co-pilots, during the chaos of combat, quietly saved missions by correcting attitude, adjusting throttles, or compensating for damaged control surfaces while the pilot concentrated on navigation or surviving the next enemy attack. Behind them stood the flight engineer, a man whose responsibilities made him the technical nerve center of the aircraft. Part mechanic, part gunner, and part system supervisor, he monitored engines, fuel flow, superchargers, oil temperatures, electrical loads, hydraulics, and cabin equipment, all while manning the powerful top turret. His vantage point above the fuselage gave him one of the best fields of fire on the plane, and many engineers became quick thinkers who could spot fighters even before the waist gunners. In emergencies, he was often the one who crawled into the wings to shut off fuel valves or repair shot-up lines while the aircraft limped home. The navigator and bombardier shared the forward compartment, yet their worlds were entirely different. The navigator lived in a quiet chaos of charts, compasses, celestial sextants, stopwatches, and radio signals. In the era before GPS or inertial navigation, plotting a course through clouds, crosswinds, and smoke required near-constant calculation. He sat hunched over his desk, pencil in hand, marking positions every few minutes while temperatures dropped far below freezing. A skilled navigator could steer a formation through storms, blind approaches, and enemy territory with uncanny precision. A less experienced one could get an entire squadron lost. His role was so vital that he was considered one of the 3 officers essential for mission success. Directly ahead of him, inside the plexiglass nose, the bombardier watched the world through one of the most advanced mechanical sights of World War II, the Norden bomb sight. To outsiders, it resembled a telescope, but inside it housed a miniature analog computer capable of calculating wind drift, altitude, airspeed, and release timing. During bomb runs, the bombardier effectively became the aircraft's temporary pilot. When the Norden took control through the autopilot system, the pilot surrendered manual flight. This was the most dangerous part of any mission. The aircraft flew straight, level, and predictable, exactly what German gunners needed. The bombardier's job was not simply to release ordnance. He had to deliver it precisely, sometimes through smoke, fog, or broken formations, while under relentless fire. And when fighters swarmed from the front, he became a gunner, swinging his 30 or 50 caliber weapon toward the oncoming threat. The radio operator occupied a compartment further back, where the narrow fuselage began its transition toward the waist section. He was the communications lifeline, transmitting position reports, receiving formation changes, updating command signals, and monitoring emergency frequencies. His equipment was sensitive, powerful, and vulnerable. Even a small fragment could silence the radio at the worst possible moment. Like the others, he manned a machine gun when needed, opening the overhead hatch and pointing a .50 caliber into the sky to ward off attackers from above. Beyond him, the waist section formed the beating wings of the aircraft's defense. The left and right waist gunners stood at open windows wearing heavy flak suits over electrically heated jackets, gripping their .50 caliber guns as the wind roared past. The early B-17F models placed the waist windows opposite each other, which meant the two gunners often collided in the heat of battle. It was a cramped, chaotic space, full of empty shell casings, oxygen lines, and swaying ammunition trays. Yet waist gunners were some of the aircraft's most effective defenders, capable of hitting fighters attacking from the sides or weaving beneath the bomber. Below them, in a small steel sphere suspended from the belly, sat the most isolated man on the plane, the ball turret gunner. Curled in a fetal position, knees tucked around the twin .50 caliber guns, he had no room to wear a parachute. His legs straddled rotating mechanisms, and his field of view was the open void of the sky passing beneath him. But from this terrifying vantage point, he had the best firing position against enemy fighters approaching from below, a favorite angle of attack for German pilots. The ball turret was cold, claustrophobic, and brutally exposed, but gunners who mastered it became some of the most respected members of any crew. At the very back of the aircraft sat the tail gunner, all alone in a compartment barely large enough for one man. His twin .50 caliber guns defended the most vulnerable approach path, directly behind the bomber. Through a narrow set of windows, he watched the formation's wake, scanning constantly for specks growing rapidly into fighters. Tail gunners were often the first to call out incoming attacks, using the familiar clock system, 6 o'clock high, that every crewman instantly understood. Their vigilance saved countless lives. Together, these 10 men formed the soul of the flying fortress. Their positions, separated by aluminum frames and clusters of equipment, were connected by the intercom, by trust, and by the knowledge that each man's task was indispensable. A B-17F could not function without its pilot or navigator, but neither could it survive without its gunners, its engineer, or its radio operator. The aircraft demanded teamwork under conditions so harsh that frostbite, hypoxia, and exhaustion were often as dangerous as enemy fire. Inside this airborne fortress, rank mattered less than reliability. When a mission began, each man stepped into his place not as an individual, but as a part of a greater whole. And though thousands of B-17 crews rotated through the war, the bond formed inside those thin aluminum walls was something few could ever describe, and none could ever forget. ChatGPT's Ghazal, the B-17F was born into a war where survival depended on the ability to strike and defend at the same time. Every mission over Europe meant facing not only walls of black flak exploding at thousands of feet, but also the relentless attacks of German fighters whose sole purpose was to break the integrity of the bomber formations. In this deadly environment, the flying fortress earned its name, not through myth or exaggeration, but through the cold, mechanical logic of its design. Chapter by chapter, mission by mission, the aircraft proved that its defensive power was every bit as important as the bombs it carried. At the heart of this defense was an array of 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, air-cooled, simple, and devastating. These guns were placed everywhere a fighter might appear: in the nose, the dorsal turret, the ball turret, both waist positions, the radio compartment, and the tail. The B-17F carried up to 13 of them, a blistering storm of defensive fire that transformed the aircraft into a floating hedgehog of steel. In the era before radar-guided missiles, combat was intimate. German pilots had to get close, sometimes within a few hundred yards, to fire effectively. And at that distance, a single burst from a 50 caliber gun could tear through an engine block, crack a cockpit canopy, or send a fighter spinning downward in flames. Yet the guns themselves were only part of the story. What truly made the B-17F dangerous to enemy aircraft was the discipline and coordination of its gunners. They trained relentlessly to keep a tight field of fire, to avoid wasting ammunition, and to call out threats using a system that every American bomber crewman knew instinctively: the clock directions. 12 o'clock high meant an enemy was approaching straight ahead and above. 3 o'clock low meant right side beneath the wing. Every man aboard responded instantly to these calls, turning his guns or preparing for the next attack. The system was simple but brilliant, an entire fortress responding to threats as a single organism. German pilots learned the deadly geometry of the B-17 the hard way. Early in the war, many tried to attack from the rear, believing it was the aircraft's weakest point. But the tail position, upper turret, and ball turret created a nearly continuous arc of fire. Fighter after fighter was struck on the first pass, sometimes fatally. Soon, the Luftwaffe adapted. They discovered that the least protected angle was the nose, where the bomber carried fewer guns and where closing speeds were terrifyingly high, often over 500 miles per hour combined. Attacking head-on gave German pilots only seconds to aim, fire, and break away. But if they succeeded, they could wreak havoc, killing the bombardier, navigator, and pilots in a single burst. The B-17F crews responded by reinforcing the nose with more guns, sometimes factory installed, sometimes improvised in the field. Extra 50 calibers appeared in side windows, cheek mounts, and jury-rigged brackets. Even so, the B-17F's frontal defenses would never match its coverage in the rear. For many bombardiers and navigators, the few seconds during a head-on attack were among the most terrifying moments of every mission. Defensive strength became truly formidable only when B-17s flew in formation. A single flying fortress could be overwhelmed by coordinated fighter attacks. But a dozen bombers flying in a box formation created overlapping arcs of fire that no German pilot could ignore. One bomber's blind spot was covered by the guns of another. Waist gunners protected neighboring aircraft. Top turrets scanned wide arcs above the entire group. When a formation was tight and disciplined, it acted as a flying fortress in the literal sense, an aerial wall bristling with heavy machine guns, each protecting the others. But this came at a cost. Flying in formation meant sacrificing maneuverability. Bombers had to maintain steady altitude and position even under heavy fire, even when enemy fighters swarmed from multiple angles. Any evasive maneuver risked collision with friendly aircraft, a constant fear when visibility dropped in clouds or smoke. Still, the formation endured because it worked. German pilots often described trying to attack a box of B-17s as flying into a furnace of tracers. The psychological impact was immense. Even experienced aces hesitated, knowing that a single miscalculation could place them in the crosshairs of a dozen Browning machine guns at once. Inside the B-17, the gunners faced their own challenges. Their weapons were simple but unforgiving. Barrel overheating was common, especially during prolonged engagements. Empty shells piled up beneath their feet, sometimes jamming oxygen lines or fouling electrical cables. Oxygen masks froze, goggles fogged, gun sights iced over. At altitudes above 25,000 feet, frostbite could strike within minutes if gloves were removed. And yet gunners fired on, clearing jams, tracking targets, shouting warnings over the intercom. Despite the deadly efficiency of B-17 formations, friendly fire remained an uncomfortable reality. In the chaos of combat, with aircraft shaking from turbulence and explosions, gunners sometimes sprayed bursts that struck neighboring bombers. A waist gunner, startled by a sudden flash of silver, might fire too quickly. A top gunner mistaking a trailing aircraft for an enemy might unleash a burst that shattered a cockpit window or clipped a wing. There were no official statistics, but memoirs from the time speak openly about accidental hits, damaged rudders, or wounded crewmen caused not by German fire, but by fellow Americans. It was an unavoidable consequence of fighting in such tight proximity under unimaginable pressure. What kept the bombers flying through these dangers was the unspoken truth every crewman understood. Their survival depended not only on the strength of their aircraft, but on the strength of the men around them. Each gunner, each call-out, each burst of fire from another plane in the formation created a shield against the predators circling above Europe. And though enemy fighters adapted, innovated, and attacked with increasing ferocity, the flying fortress met them with equal resolve. In the bitter cold at 30,000 feet, amid tracers, smoke trails, and the deafening roar of engines and gunfire, the B-17F and its crew learned what it meant to fight not just as individuals, but as a single, unbreakable force. The B-17F was not simply a bomber. It was a fuel-dependent lifeline stretched across hostile skies, where every gallon, every pump, and every valve could decide whether a crew lived long enough to see home again. Long-range missions over Europe demanded precision, not just in navigation, but in fuel management so delicate that even the slightest miscalculation could doom an aircraft already struggling against cold winds, engine failures, and rising columns of flak. And in the depths of this complexity lay one of the greatest engineering feats of the Flying Fortress, its elaborate, layered, and sometimes dangerously fragile fuel system. At its core, the B-17F carried 6 main fuel tanks, 3 in each wing, forming the backbone of the bomber's range. Engines Tharper 1 and Tharper 4 drew from single dedicated tanks, while engines Tharper 2 and Tharper 3, positioned closer to the fuselage, were supported by 2 tanks each. This asymmetry allowed the aircraft to maintain stability as fuel levels dropped. But these tanks were more than simple metal containers. They were self-sealing, built from layers of gasoline-reactive rubber enclosed within a soft aluminum shell. When punctured by enemy rounds, the inner rubber swelled on contact with fuel, naturally closing the wound. Many crews credited these tanks with their survival, describing the hissing, bubbling sounds of self-sealing rubber, doing its work even as the plane shook from nearby explosions. Yet the B-17F needed more than 6 tanks to reach deep into Germany. That need gave birth to the so-called Tokyo tanks, named for their theoretical extension of operational range, though no B-17 ever flew to Tokyo. 18 of these collapsible rubber tanks were packed into the wings, 9 on each side, tucked into spaces never intended for fuel. They held an additional 1,080 gallons, an extraordinary increase that transformed the fortress into a true long-range bomber. But unlike the main tanks, the Tokyo tanks lacked rigid housings, pumps, or protective aluminum skins. They relied solely on gravity to feed fuel into the main system, and their vulnerability was well known. In extreme cold, vapor could accumulate in the tanks, turning them into explosive hazards. A single incendiary round striking the right spot could ignite fumes and engulf the wing in a firestorm. Even with these risks, crews depended on the extra fuel. Some missions required every drop, including those carried inside the optional auxiliary tank mounted temporarily in the bomb bay. This massive metal container, holding 820 gallons, reduced bomb load but pushed the total fuel capacity to an extraordinary 3,600 gallons. When installed, crews had to clamber around it, checking connections and valves, knowing full well that a single hit in the wrong place might turn the bomb bay into a burning pit. The flight engineer became the guardian of this volatile system. He monitored fuel gauges constantly, switching feed lines, balancing consumption between wings, and watching for signs of leaks or pump failures. In many cases, engineers crawled into the wings mid-flight, through narrow maintenance tunnels, to manually shut valves or reroute fuel around damaged lines. Frostbite, darkness, and the howling of the wind outside did not stop them. The plane's life depended on their hands. But fuel management was only half of the story. The B-17F's flight systems also reflected a philosophy of redundancy and simplicity. Hydraulics operated only essential equipment, wheel brakes and cowl flaps. Everything else, landing gear, flaps, bomb bay doors, was powered electrically. It was a deliberate choice. Electrical systems were easier to duplicate, easier to isolate, and more tolerant of damage. So long as a single engine-driven generator remained functional, the aircraft could operate its weapons, lighting, and critical controls. And when all else failed, a gasoline-powered auxiliary generator in the tail compartment could supply emergency power to radios and essential instruments. Still, no amount of redundancy prevented the inevitable mechanical failures that came with combat. Engines were often damaged, oil lines ruptured, superchargers jammed, propellers refused to feather. The regulations declared that a B-17 should be able to fly on 2 engines, but regulation rarely met reality. A fortress with 2 dead engines often began an uncontrollable descent. Crews dumped bombs, jettisoned ammunition, even threw out personal gear in desperate attempts to maintain altitude. And yet sometimes, through stubborn luck and brute engineering, a crippled airplane would defy the odds. Stories from returning crews became legends. A bomber limping home with an entire section of the wing missing, another flying hundreds of miles on a single functioning engine, and still another landing with the control cables shot away, guided only by differential throttle inputs from a pilot who refused to give up. These weren't embellishments. They were testaments to the intricate balance of structure, systems, and human determination that defined the B-17F. The most harrowing moments of any mission came during the bomb run. With the formation aligned, the pilot engaged the autopilot, effectively handing control of the aircraft to the bombardier through the Norden bomb site. The fortress flew straight and true, predictable and exposed. Flak gunners on the ground waited for these agonizing moments, adjusting fire as the bombers approached. Without the ability to maneuver, the B-17F relied on its durability, hoping its thin aluminum skin, redundant wiring, and self-sealing tanks could withstand the storm. Many did. Many did not. Yet every crewman understood this truth. Surviving a mission on a B-17F was not luck. It was a chain of systems, each designed with purpose. A team of men, each trained to act without hesitation, and an airframe built to take punishment that would destroy nearly any other machine of its generation. The distance a fortress could travel, its ability to push deep into enemy territory and still claw its way back, wasn't just a measure of fuel capacity. It was a measure of resolve, engineering, and the unbreakable bond between a bomber and the men who trusted it with their lives. The legacy of the B-17F Flying Fortress was written not only in metal and machinery, but in the stories of the men who flew it. the sacrifices made in the skies over Europe, and the irreversible shift this aircraft brought to the nature of modern warfare. By the time the war reached its decisive years, the B-17F had become more than just a bomber. It had become a symbol of resilience, of industrial might, and of the quiet determination of thousands of young Americans who found themselves fighting 3 miles above the earth in a world of ice, smoke, and fire. Its combat history began humbly enough. Early production models entered service in 1942 at a time when Allied air strategy was still taking shape. The United States Army Air Forces held a firm belief that heavily armed bombers, flying in disciplined formations, could defend themselves without fighter escorts. It was a bold theory, one that promised a way to strike deep inside enemy territory. But it was also a dangerous gamble, one that would soon exact a terrible cost. In the first months of operations, the B-17F proved its ruggedness again and again. Bombers returned home peppered with shell fragments, their fuselages torn like paper, landing with entire sections of rudder missing or engines hanging limp from their mounts. Crews stepped out onto runways in England, stunned that they were still alive. Newspapers back home printed photographs of bullet-riddled fortresses, each story reinforcing the aircraft's mythic status. Yet for all its legendary toughness, the B-17F faced a simple mathematical truth. It could not outfight the entire Luftwaffe on its own. By mid-1943, the air over Europe had become one of the deadliest battlegrounds of the war. German fighter groups, equipped with Bf-109s, FW-190s, and later heavily armed Zerstörer twin-engine fighters, defended their homeland with ferocity. Their mission was clear: break the bombers before they reached their targets. Their tactics grew increasingly specialized. Some pilots targeted the cockpit with 30mm cannon shells that could decapitate an entire crew in a single hit. Others fired rockets from a distance to scatter the formation before diving in for the kill. On the ground, radar-guided flak batteries filled the sky with black bursts, each one capable of shredding aluminum and steel. The B-17F crews flew into this storm day after day. Missions to Bremen, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Stuttgart pushed aircraft and airmen to their limits. The most infamous of these, the second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943, later known simply as Black Thursday, became a turning point. 60 bombers were lost in a single day. Hundreds of airmen were killed, captured, or vanished into the countryside of occupied Europe. The official reports claimed nearly 300 German fighters were destroyed, but historians now believe the real number was closer to 40. No amount of heroism could change the harsh reality. Unescorted bombers could not survive the deep penetrations into the Reich. And yet, even in defeat, the B-17F proved something vital. It demonstrated the necessity of coordinated air power, the integration of fighters, bombers, maintenance crews, navigators, intelligence officers, meteorologists, and factories across the Atlantic, working together as a single strategic force. The heavy losses forced rapid changes. The arrival of long-range P-51 Mustang escorts in early 1944 transformed the air war. With fighters accompanying them to the target and back, the B-17 formations suddenly became nearly unstoppable. They smashed oil refineries, aircraft factories, transportation hubs, and industrial centers. Their bombs crippled the Luftwaffe's ability to train new pilots, fuel its aircraft, or repair damaged supply lines. By late 1944, German fighter units were mere shadows of their former strength. Throughout this shift, the B-17F stood at the center of the offensive. Between 1935 and May 1945, an astonishing 12,131 B-17s were built, a testament to American industrial capacity. Nearly 5,000 of them were lost during combat missions, a number that reflects not weakness, but the scale of the air war itself. Entire bomb groups rotated through England, their crews completing 25 or 30 mission tours, an eternity in a world where each flight carried a 1 in 5 chance of never returning. Yet morale held, in part because the aircraft earned the trust of its crews. Pilots spoke of its forgiving controls, its stability even when half destroyed, and its ability to take punishment that would doom any other bomber of the era. Some of the most remarkable stories came from damaged aircraft limping home, a fortress flying hundreds of miles with a shredded vertical stabilizer, another returning with 40% of its wing blown away, one whose pilot navigated all the way back to England using only throttle adjustments after losing all control cables to flak. These accounts were not exaggerations. They were documented, photographed, and attested to by stunned ground crews. And then there was the human legacy. The B-17F's narrow fuselage, freezing temperatures, and constant threat of death forged bonds among crewmen that lasted a lifetime. Pilots remembered the tension in the bombardier's voice as enemy fighters closed in. Waist gunners recalled the deafening roar of 50 caliber guns firing inches from their faces. Radio operators described nights when they held the only link between a crippled aircraft and the rest of the formation. Navigators spoke of cloud banks, storms, and dead reckoning over enemy territory, knowing that a single miscalculation could lose the entire group. Not all stories ended triumphantly. Thousands of airmen died inside the thin aluminum walls of B-17Fs. Many others spent years in prison camps after being shot down. And yet in the decades that followed, survivors spoke of their service not with bitterness, but with pride. They had flown one of the most iconic machines ever built, an aircraft that played a central role in turning the tide of the war. By war's end, only a handful of B-17Fs remained intact. Today, just 3 survive. Only one of these, the famed Memphis Belle, flew a full combat tour over Europe, completing 25 missions and returning home as a national symbol. The Belle's final landing in the United States was greeted with fanfare, parades, and war bond rallies. She embodied the nation's admiration for the crews who took to the skies in machines that were as dangerous as they were heroic. The cultural impact of the B-17F has endured far beyond the war. Its silhouette, 4 engines, distinctive tail, wide wings, remains one of the most recognizable shapes in aviation history. Museums around the world preserve surviving airframes with reverence, and aviation enthusiasts still travel thousands of miles to see them fly at air shows. Pilots who have had the privilege to take the controls of a restored B-17 describe it as stepping back into history, a tangible connection to a generation whose courage reshaped the world. More than 8 decades after its creation, the B-17F Flying Fortress remains a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of victory in the face of overwhelming danger. Its legacy is not just measured in tons of bombs dropped or factories destroyed, but in the thousands of airmen whose stories it carries, stories of fear, endurance, and unbreakable resolve. The aircraft that once shook the skies of Europe now rests in quiet hangars and memorials, but its spirit endures in every photograph, every survivor's memory, and every heartbeat of the generation that trusted it to bring them home.